Karen Jones was having a bad day. She had just returned home from a frustrating trip to the DMV, where she had waited in line for over 2 hours only to be told that her driver's license renewal was rejected due to an outstanding parking ticket. As she pulled into her driveway, her eyes immediately fell upon her neighbor's son Jared, who was carefully spray painting a mural on the side of his family's garage. Fuming, Karen stormed over to the unsuspecting teenager. "Jared, what do you think you're doing?" she yelled, her voice laced with accusation. Jared turned around, startled by Karen's sudden outburst. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Jones. I'm just helping my dad paint a mural for the city's beautification project. They asked us to do it." Karen scoffed, her face twisted in a scowl. "Paint a mural? Don't give me that nonsense. I know vandalism when I see it. You're defacing public property, you little hoodlum." Jared's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No, Mrs. Jones, you've got it all wrong. The city commissioned us to do this." "Save it," Karen interrupted, her finger pointed accusingly at the teenager. "I'm calling the police. You're going to jail for this, young man." Before Jared could even respond, Karen had stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood as 2 police officers arrived on the scene. Jared's father, Tom, had been working inside the garage when he heard the commotion. He rushed outside to find his son being handcuffed by the officers. "What's going on here?" Tom demanded, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Your son is under arrest for vandalism," one of the officers stated matter-of-factly. "We received a call reporting him for defacing public property." "What? No, that can't be right," Tom protested. "Jared was just helping me with a mural for the city's beautification project. We have permission to do this." The officers exchanged a puzzled glance. "Man, is that true?" one of them asked, turning to Karen, who had emerged from her house. Karen crossed her arms defiantly. "Of course not. I saw that boy spraying graffiti all over my neighbor's garage. He's a vandal, plain and simple." "Mrs. Jones, I can assure you that we have permission from the city to do this," Tom interjected. "I have the paperwork right here." The officers looked torn, unsure of whom to believe. Jared stood there, his hands cuffed behind his back, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. "Please, officers, you have to believe us," Tom pleaded. "Jared is not a vandal. He's just trying to help improve our community." The tension in the air was palpable as the officers deliberated, the fate of the young boy hanging in the balance. The officers exchanged a long, contemplative look before one of them finally spoke up. "All right, let's get this straightened out," he said, addressing Tom and Karen. "Ma'am, can you please provide us with any evidence or documentation that shows your neighbor's son was indeed engaged in vandalism?" Karen's face flushed with indignation. "Evidence? Are you serious? I saw him with my own 2 eyes, spraying that awful graffiti all over the garage." "But Mrs. Jones, as I've already told you, we have permission from the city to do this mural," Tom interjected, his voice laced with frustration. "I have the paperwork right here." The officers turned to Tom. "If that's the case, we'll need to see that documentation." Tom quickly retrieved the folder containing the approval and permits from the city, handing it over to the officers. They carefully reviewed the paperwork, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to understanding. "It appears you were telling the truth, sir," one of the officers said, nodding. "This mural is indeed an approved city project. We'll have to release your son." Jared let out a sigh of relief as the officers uncuffed him, but Karen's face contorted with outrage. "This is an outrage," she shouted, her hands clenched into fists. "You're just going to let him go. He's a criminal, and you know it." The officers looked taken aback by Karen's vehement reaction. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the evidence, and it's clear your neighbor was not engaged in any unlawful activity. We have no grounds to arrest him." But I saw him with my own eyes," Karen insisted, her voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. "He was spraying that garage, and you're just going to let him get away with it." Tom stepped forward, his expression a mix of exasperation and pity. "Mrs. Jones, I understand you're upset, but Jared was doing nothing wrong. He was simply helping me with a city-approved project. Perhaps you should have verified the facts before making such a serious accusation." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but her stubborn pride refused to let her back down. "I know what I saw, and I won't stand for this injustice," she spat, glaring at the officers. The officers exchanged a weary glance, clearly exhausted by the confrontation. "Ma'am, if you have any further concerns, we'd be happy to discuss them with you at the station. But as of now, we have no reason to detain your neighbor or his son." With those words, the officers turned and made their way back to their patrol car, leaving a fuming Karen behind. Jared and his father watched them go, both relieved that the ordeal was over, but unsettled by the intensity of Karen's outburst. As the patrol car disappeared down the street, Karen's gaze burned with a newfound determination. She had no intention of letting this go. She would find a way to prove that Jared was a criminal, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, Karen's obsession with exposing Jared's alleged wrongdoing only grew stronger. She spent hours scouring the neighborhood, searching for any evidence that could support her claim that the teenager was a vandal. Unfortunately for Karen, Jared and his father continued to work diligently on the mural, with the full approval and support of the local authorities. Whenever Karen tried to interrupt their progress or make another accusation, the officers would promptly shut her down, reminding her that the project had been officially sanctioned by the city. Undeterred, Karen began to take more drastic measures. She started calling the city's Parks and Recreation Department, demanding that they revoke the permit and stop the mural project. However, the department representatives were unswayed by her claims, politely informing her that the mural was an approved beautification initiative and that they had no plans to intervene. Frustrated by her inability to make any headway, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. One night, under the cover of darkness, she crept over to the garage, armed with a can of black spray paint. Carefully, she began to cover up the vibrant mural, determined to erase any evidence of Jared's supposed vandalism. But just as she was about to finish her work, a bright light suddenly flooded the area, and a voice boomed out from behind her. "Freeze. This is the police. Drop the can and put your hands up." Karen whirled around in shock, the spray paint can slipping from her grasp as she raised her hands in surrender. To her horror, she found herself staring down the barrels of two police officers' guns, their expressions stern and unyielding. "Mrs. Jones, we've been informed that you've been tampering with a city-approved mural," one of the officers said, his voice laced with disappointment. "That's considered an act of vandalism, and we have no choice but to place you under arrest." As the officers cuffed her wrists and read her Miranda rights, Karen's mind raced with panicked thoughts. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She was the one exposing the crime, not the one being arrested. How could the police be so blind to the truth? Jared and his father, who had been alerted by the commotion, emerged from their home, their faces a mixture of surprise and relief. They watched in stunned silence as Karen was led away, her protests and cries of innocence falling on deaf ears. In that moment, Karen realized that her obsession had gone too far. She had crossed a line, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. As the police car pulled away, she couldn't help but wonder if she had finally met her match in the form of a determined teenager and his supportive father. The next morning, Karen sat in the harsh glare of the interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the metal table as she stared defiantly at the two officers who had arrested her the previous night. "All right, Mrs. Jones, let's go over this one more time," the senior officer said, his brow furrowed in a disapproving frown. "You were caught red-handed vandalizing a city-approved mural." Now, I know you've been making accusations against your neighbor's son, but the evidence clearly shows that he and his father were working on a legitimate project. Karen's lips tightened into a thin, stubborn line. I don't care what your precious evidence says. I know what I saw, and that boy was up to no good. He's a vandal, just like I said. The officer let out a weary sigh. Ma'am, we've already verified the permits and paperwork. Your neighbor has done nothing wrong. You, on the other hand, were caught in the act of damaging public property. That's a serious offense. But I was just trying to expose the truth. Karen protested, her voice rising in desperation. That boy needs to be held accountable for his actions. You can't just let him get away with it. The other officer, a younger and more sympathetic-looking man, leaned forward in his chair. Mrs. Jones, I understand you feel strongly about this, but the facts simply don't support your allegations. Your neighbor and his son have cooperated fully with the authorities, and there's no evidence to suggest they've done anything illegal. Karen's eyes narrowed, her frustration palpable. So, you're telling me that I'm the one who's going to be punished for trying to stop a crime? This is an outrage. I'm afraid that's exactly what's happening, ma'am, the senior officer said, his tone firm. You broke the law by vandalizing that mural, and there are consequences for that. We can't simply ignore it just because you think you were in the right. Tears of anger and resentment welled up in Karen's eyes as she realized the gravity of her situation. She had been so convinced of her own righteousness that she had failed to see the consequences of her actions. Now, she was facing the very real possibility of criminal charges and the loss of her freedom. This isn't fair, she cried, slamming her fists against the table. I was just trying to protect my community from that troublemaker. Why can't you see that? The officers exchanged a weary look, their patience clearly wearing thin. Mrs. Jones, the law doesn't care about your personal crusade. You broke the law, and now you have to face the consequences. The best thing you can do is cooperate with us and let the justice system run its course. As the officers stood to leave, Karen felt a growing sense of dread and desperation. She had never imagined that her quest to expose Jared's supposed wrongdoing would lead her to this point. Now, she was the one facing punishment, and she had no idea how to escape the predicament she had created for herself. As the days passed, Karen's situation only grew more dire. She had been charged with vandalism and was facing the possibility of a hefty fine or even jail time. The thought of being punished for her actions, rather than Jared, filled her with a burning resentment that only continued to fuel her determination. Desperate to avoid the consequences of her crime, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands once again. This time, she hatched a plan to discredit Jared and his father in the eyes of the authorities, hoping that it would somehow absolve her of her own wrongdoing. She began reaching out to local news outlets, spinning a narrative that painted Jared as a troublemaker and his father as an accomplice. Karen claimed that the mural was nothing more than a cover-up for a larger vandalism scheme, and that the city had been duped into approving the project. To her surprise, a few local news stations were intrigued by the story and agreed to investigate further. Karen felt a surge of triumph, convinced that she was finally about to expose the truth and clear her name. However, her triumph was short-lived. When the reporters began digging into the facts, they quickly discovered that Karen's accusations were entirely unfounded. Not only did they uncover the valid permits and approvals for the mural, but they also learned about Karen's own arrest for vandalism. Humiliated and furious, Karen lashed out at the reporters, accusing them of being biased and refusing to see the real story. But her outbursts only served to further damage her credibility, and the news coverage painted her as an unstable and vindictive individual. As the media attention died down, Karen found herself facing an even more daunting challenge: the impending court case. Her attorney had advised her to plead guilty and accept a plea bargain, but Karen's stubborn pride refused to let her back down. I won't admit to something I didn't do, she shouted during one of their meetings. That boy is the real criminal, and I'm going to prove it, even if it's the last thing I do." Her lawyer sighed, shaking his head in exasperation. "Mrs. Jones, the evidence is overwhelming. Your best chance at avoiding a harsh sentence is to cooperate with the prosecution. Continuing to fight this battle is only going to make things worse for you." But Karen was unwilling to listen. She was convinced that she was in the right, and she would stop at nothing to vindicate herself, even if it meant risking her own freedom in the process. As the trial date approached, Karen's obsession with bringing down Jared only grew stronger, and she began to hatch an even more desperate plan to ensure that her name was cleared, no matter the cost. The day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Karen sat at the defense table, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation as she waited for the proceedings to begin. When the judge entered and called the case to order, Karen's lawyer immediately stood up, addressing the court. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a motion to dismiss the charges against my client, Mrs. Karen Jones." The prosecutor, a seasoned and no-nonsense attorney, rose to her feet, her brow furrowed in confusion. "On what grounds, Your Honor?" Karen's lawyer cleared his throat, his gaze shifting nervously between the judge and the prosecutor. "My client has uncovered new evidence that she believes will exonerate her and expose the true perpetrator of the vandalism." The prosecutor scoffed, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Your Honor, we've already reviewed all the evidence in this case, and it clearly shows that Mrs. Jones was caught in the act of vandalizing a city-approved mural. I see no reason to grant this motion." The judge fixed Karen's lawyer with a stern look. "Counselor, I hope you have something substantial to present. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to deny your request." Karen's lawyer swallowed hard, glancing nervously at his client. "Your Honor, my client claims to have evidence that the neighbor's son, Jared, was the true perpetrator of the vandalism, and that he has been framing Mrs. Jones to cover up his own wrongdoing." The prosecutor's eyes widened in disbelief. "Your Honor, this is simply preposterous. We've already established that the mural was a city-sanctioned project, and the neighbor's son has been fully cooperative with the authorities." The judge held up a hand, silencing the prosecutor. "Let's hear what Mrs. Jones has to offer. Proceed, Counselor." Karen's lawyer turned to face the jury, his expression a mixture of confidence and trepidation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client has obtained a video recording that she believes will prove Jared's involvement in the vandalism." With a dramatic flourish, he pressed a button on a nearby laptop, and a large screen behind the judge came to life, displaying a grainy, nighttime security footage. As the video played, the courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on the screen. At first, there was nothing of note, just the quiet suburban street and the newly painted mural on the garage wall. But then, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving stealthily towards the mural. The person paused, taking a quick look around, before producing a can of spray paint and beginning to deface the artwork. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as the video played out, her eyes fixed on the screen. She was certain that the vandal was Jared, and that this evidence would finally prove her right. However, as the figure turned to face the camera, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. For there, in plain view, was the unmistakable face of Karen Jones, her expression twisted in a determined scowl as she continued to cover the mural in a thick coat of black paint. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud, silencing the stunned murmurs that had erupted in the room. "Order! Order in the court!" he bellowed, his face a mask of disbelief. Karen sat in her chair, her hands trembling, as the realization of what she had done finally dawned on her. She had gambled everything on this last-ditch effort to prove her innocence, and now it had all come crashing down around her. The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of whispers and muttered exclamations as the video evidence played out on the screen. Karen sat in stunned silence, her face a mask of disbelief and horror as the damning footage clearly showed her vandalizing the mural that she had so fervently accused Jared of defacing. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order in the courtroom. Order. I will have order in this court. He fixed Karen with a stern gaze, his brow furrowed in disappointment. Mrs. Jones, do you have any explanation for this evidence we've just witnessed? Karen's lawyer stood up, his face pale and his hands trembling. Your Honor, I was not aware of the contents of this video. My client assured me that it would exonerate her, and The judge raised a hand, silencing the lawyer. It's quite clear from the footage that your client was the one engaging in the act of vandalism, not the young man she had accused. He turned his attention to Karen, his voice laced with contempt. Mrs. Jones, do you have anything to say for yourself? Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She'd have been so convinced of her own righteousness, so certain that she was the one exposing the truth, that the realization of her own wrongdoing had left her utterly speechless. Finally, she stammered, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and desperation. Your Honor, I can explain. I was just trying to. Trying to what, Mrs. Jones? The judge interrupted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Trying to frame an innocent young man for a crime you yourself committed? I'm afraid your excuses are not going to cut it here. The prosecutor stepped forward, her expression grim. Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence presented here today, I would like to recommend that the defendant, Karen Jones, be found guilty of vandalism and sentenced accordingly. The judge nodded solemnly. Given the clear and irrefutable nature of the evidence presented, I have no choice but to agree with the prosecution's recommendation. Mrs. Jones, you are hereby found guilty of vandalism. This court will convene in 1 week's time to determine an appropriate sentence. As the gavel came down, a collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Jared and his father, who had been watching the proceedings with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction, knew that justice had finally been served. Karen, on the other hand, sat in her chair, her face etched with a mixture of shame, anger, and utter defeat. She had been so convinced of her own righteousness, so determined to bring down Jared, that she had failed to see the inevitable consequences of her own actions. Now, she was facing the harsh reality of her own undoing, with no one to blame but herself. A week later, the courtroom was once again filled with the buzz of activity as the sentencing hearing for Karen Jones began. The judge, his face a mask of stern disapproval, called the court to order and addressed the defendant. Mrs. Jones, you have been found guilty of the crime of vandalism. This was not a minor offense, but a deliberate act of destruction against a city-approved public art project. Your actions not only caused financial damage, but also disrupted the community's efforts to beautify the neighborhood. Karen sat in her chair, her gaze downcast, unable to meet the judge's piercing stare. She knew that her stubborn refusal to accept responsibility had led her to this point, and she braced herself for the consequences. The judge continued, his voice unwavering. During this trial, it has become abundantly clear that your actions were driven by a misguided sense of self-righteousness and an overwhelming desire to shift blame onto an innocent party. Your repeated attempts to frame the young man, Jared, have only served to exacerbate the severity of your crime. Karen cringed, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as the judge's words cut through her like a sharp knife. She had been so convinced of her own superiority, so certain that she was the one exposing the truth, that the realization of her own downfall was a bitter and humiliating pill to swallow. Therefore, the judge proclaimed, it is the judgment of this court that you, Karen Jones, be sentenced to 6 months in county jail, followed by a period of probation and community service. Your actions have not only harmed the community, but have also displayed a complete disregard for the rule of law. This sentence is a reflection of the gravity of your offense and a warning that such behavior will not be tolerated. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the proceedings, Karen felt a wave of overwhelming despair wash over her. She had lost everything: her freedom, her reputation, and any semblance of the moral high ground she had so desperately clung to. The irony of it all was not lost on her. In her quest to expose the wrongdoing of others, she had become the true perpetrator of a heinous crime. As the bailiffs escorted her from the courtroom, Karen caught a glimpse of Jared and his father, their expressions a mix of relief and satisfaction. She knew that she had been outmaneuvered, her own sense of entitlement and delusion having been her ultimate undoing. In the end, the lesson was a harsh one, but it was one that Karen Jones would be forced to confront head-on. Her journey from self-righteous accuser to convicted vandal was a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice can sometimes lead down a dangerous and unintended path, one that can ultimately consume the very person who set out to expose the truth.